Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining this session of Know Your MIP. Today we have a special guest, recognized Delegate Tim Black, joining us to discuss the Core Unit Offboarding process amendments that he has been working on collaboratively with many members across the DAO. Uh, as normal, please feel free to ask any questions that you have throughout the presentation. We'll be happy to take breaks in the action to have them addressed in real time. For reference, at the bottom of the screen, there should be a link to the MIP if you'd like to have that up. And with that, I'll gladly toss the mic over to Tim to kick things off.
GM, everybody. Tim Black here from the Black Loops, or FBL for short. I'm going to go through a presentation of the MIP amendments for Core Unit Offboarding, and in general, just revising the whole Core Unit MIP set around everything except for MIP 40, which we recently got. So I have a presentation prepared. It's essentially just a nicer formatting of everything we already put on the forum. So for this call, I'll set some context, and then that'll also be great for the viewing audience that comes to YouTube, all several dozen of them later when they want to read it. So I'm going to get my screen share going and move this thing over. As Retro noted, please just try and interrupt. I'll occasionally pan back and forth. This is meant to be as interactive as we can. There is still a little bit of friction at the end of the end of the MIP set, MIP 41. And I'd love to sort of engage with folks to frame the next steps on those conversations and see where we can go. So for now, let's get to the Memiverse. All right, cool. So I'm moving this thing over there. Slideshow up and running. Are we good? Looks like we're set.
Looks good.
Cool. All right, so we got to figure out a better naming convention for things, but this is our Know Your MIP number 12, I guess, on MIP 4 Component 2 SP 15, which is the Core Unit revisions that frankly were spearheaded by a lot of smart folks and then taken over by me, I guess, but really a lot of the credit goes to GovAlpha for collaborating on this, specifically for Blimpa and Gala to call me out and ask really great questions. So here we go. TLDR for this whole thing is the theme of thankless clarity. Thankless because the work is relatively only going to be noticed by people who are applying for core units, revising core units, offboarding them, and hopefully at the end of it, it's a much clearer and smoother process for everybody. And so at a high level, the changelog here is mostly dumbed down from what I posted on the forum, which is that MIP 38 in our current context was a little confusing. So we fixed that up a little bit. We also took the framework for core units, which was both a definition and an implementation, and put it actually in MIP 38, which was all about defining what core units were anyway. And that came from doing a overhaul to MIP 39, which is the core unit mandate and other pieces. There were a bunch of mentions to requisite MIPs that were missing. We tied those back. We finalized, again, that framework definition for core units, putting it in 38, putting it in 39. Blimpa made some great flow charts because it was really tough to think some of these processes through without actually seeing them. We also plugged a lot of holes in MIP 41. There was mention of different processes, but they weren't really defined. And we also realized that the simulations and thinking through situations for losing facilitators, or if they're interim or they're moving into a different status, was just not anywhere. And so we defined those. So now we know what retirement looks like. So I guess as a DAO, we got that going for us. Hopefully, this presentation, I timed it as only about 15 or 20 minutes, so we can use up some of our time while we're here to take the latter half of this call and explore some solutions for the fallback process. That feels like the last piece of friction for this whole MIP amendment set. It's really just going to be sourcing some ideas here and then putting those up as the sort of last pull requests. And so diving into it, one of the first places we found ourselves was like this meme here on the right. When we kept reading MIP 38, we were like, hold up, what? So we realized the key was that the framework was there, but it wasn't really defined. And so much like a couple of other MIP sets where something is defined in one, reinstated in another, and then stated again in another one, we just set the core unit framework to be like clearly in one place, the starting MIP or when you need it, again in where you define the core unit, and again in MIP 41. So now there's a single reference text, which makes it a lot clearer. We also felt that defining it in that first MIP was just more logical in general, right? If you think about new applicants who are coming in, they're going to wonder what a core unit really is, and just seeing it up front rather than like loosely mentioned and brought up later just is much easier to see and easier to use. And like I said, it's also in MIP 39. And one slight change is that we flipped the MIP 38 title from a state to a list, because as MIP editors were noting, it really is just a list of all the core units. There isn't really much state change particularly. So thing there. I would say by far the biggest amount of effort all the way back, going back to like January, but through the entire sessions of thinking all these revisions through is on MIP 39. So a specific shout out to Blimpa and Gala from GovAlpha for volunteering time and coming in and being helpful. And frankly, just like challenging a lot of assumptions and throwing edits back and forth. It was like a ton of, like I said, thankless work. For MIP 39, we did a lot for clarifying onboarding, refreshing, and offboarding especially, which is the original inspiration for this MIP revision. Using the current context of a year of, I guess you could say, operating, quote unquote, as a DAO, we removed mentions of the foundation. We kept some. Like I said, we moved those definitions to MIP 38, and we changed MIP 39C1 to be more explicitly about mandates, which again, hopefully adds to that clarity theme. We added some modifications to the second component, especially around refreshing core unit mandates and renaming them, which after a year seems like it would probably be pretty useful. There was also some fluff here and there that seemed like it was more made for the forums than actually part of MIPS. And so we removed those and put those out there. Just another shout out to Blimpa for flowcharts. I'm going to bring those up in a second so you can see them. And then the biggest thrust of the work was thinking through these components, how they all come together, especially with offboarding for component number 3. And so we really did a ton of thinking and revisions to the template for offboarding. And we thought about what is triggered when this sort of action happens, what handoffs need to occur. We defined quote unquote unwinding when it comes to both the team and then the actual work itself. And luckily, we also sort of figured out what are the incentives that come in play for MIP 41. We also made specific call outs to permissions, which especially in tech-enabled platforms is actually really important. If people miss a handoff, then you could be stuck with no keys to a domain, as an example, which is particularly not the best. And so ideally from all these changes, it means that handing over assets and winding down work is just less messy, which means less drama. It means less time on the forum dealing with stuff. On that, it also means that the template from MIP 39C3, the offboarding template, is now robust, which is great. And so here are the flowcharts, so pretty that I mentioned. So one thing we noticed is that the core unit MIP set is actually a bundle, which has been a pattern. And so we now just have a nice image, makes it really clear, especially for new core units that are coming online, that yes, when you put a bundle of volts up, it goes into one sender ratification pool, and then boom, you have created your core unit. We also added something for revising mandates or changing names. So it's much clearer to just see how you can change your core unit, which is super helpful for me. I'm a visual learner, but again, like this is now in the actual MIP. It will be part of that thing that will display on the portal, which is really great. And I mentioned more flowcharts. This is the very, very large set of work that we put into thinking through facilitators cooperating or not cooperating with being offboarded. And so this is also included in MIP 41, but it is also ties into MIP 39. So if you're going to offboard someone, there's usually some level here at the top of being willing to or not willing to help unwind a core unit. And so we spent a lot of time tying together these different MIPs and processes to understand how the flows come together. And so I'm happy to dive into this later because it really just gets into specific situations with like a simple binary decision or like something that needs to be made by the community. But essentially, we now have a little bit more of a smooth process to hand things off, to unwind a team, to understand if there's a budget up front, to articulate that budget if it isn't there, which MIP goes into which parts of those. And it's all in this much cleaner source. So that's that whole thing. One big shout out I want to do is for Paper Imperium, who got this whole ball rolling. The MIP 39 offboarding template is actually much the same as January. The inspiration here is that removing a core unit is painful, but it doesn't have to be slow and painful, and it doesn't have to be vague. And so ideally, using this template means that you just have a much more articulate way of taking a core unit off the books. The other thing, and this is probably the most important part of having this be on a public call, is that you just need one component to remove a core unit. Let that sink in. This is all you need. You need to fill out one template, which makes things much simpler in a bunch of different ways. But the upfront trade-off is that you need to explain why, what explicit work is fulfilled, what implicit work is fulfilled or not fulfilled. It means you need to put in the legwork if you want to offboard a team. So that's that trade-off. We presume, at least from all the meetings that we sat together to think these through and all the comments we got on the forum and some of the original discussions, that if you want to actually offboard a team from the DAO, then you should probably just reach out to the facilitator to understand what work they're doing or not doing. And if you are unsatisfied as someone who is running an offboarding, well, then you've got specificity, which just makes things more clear, and clarity is key, especially in a distributed org like this. As I mentioned earlier, we split unwinding into the work, which should be completed, delegated, or archived with supplemental documentation, the facilitator, and specifically their powers. If you guys later watching this video, you won't really see the chat, but they're talking about a specific problem with handing over a domain's access, which to their CMS, which would have been handled if it was had a very clear template for offboarding somebody. We also included a special shout out to budgets and special cases for budgets that haven't quite transitioned to the new MIP 40 that we just passed a couple of weeks ago, which is, I think, MIP 4C2 SP19 or the new MIP 40. So that makes it a lot easier to articulate what work isn't being done, how should it like proceed to be not done anymore. Ultimately, it means there's just less mess overall. There's streamlined work up front for removal, and as a bonus, we have more clarity. I figured this is also a good point to add another trade-off. I wouldn't say it's a trinity, it's just another one, but I wanted to call special attention to say that, you know, MKR holders, especially, and delegates need to be super selective with more core units, because as much as this makes things simpler being one component, it also means that there is inherently more friction interpersonally, I'd say. So until we have like even faster frameworks spinning teams up and down, which there's plenty of research going on about that, we just have to be hopefully more thoughtful. But if you want to offboard, it is here. And then MIP 41 is where we spent a lot of our time thinking through how those wily facilitators are going to go and do crazy things. But we spent a lot of time cleaning up definitions in here, and adding language and fixing component by component. And like I said, tying it back to the other MIPs that we revised. And that's really where the complexity and the time it took to make all of these changes, that's where that really came from. So it wasn't really scope creeping. It was more just kind of, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if this thing goes down? And so on those notes of the sort of vague comments, there are things for MIP 41 and the components in MIP 41, component 2, component 3, where we talk about defining a facilitator, where we just reordered the text so it's more clear, but there was no significant changes. For component 4, that's where we really started thrusting in a lot of those thoughts that we learned from the other MIPs, where we defined removing of powers, we defined a retiring facilitator, we defined the interim facilitator earlier in the whole scope of what a facilitator is. On component 5, we also introduced what interim facilitators are, especially within the context of like an offboarding core unit, which is where we just came from in this call, at least talking that through. We added context also around nominating new facilitators if a facilitator voluntarily steps down. Luckily, the DAO has seen this a few different times and has executed this quite well. So that model is clear, but now it's also defined in this MIP amendment. So for future reference, new MIP authors can see that. And then component 6 is where we further defined interim facilitators. This seemed to be like the hardest thing to think through is when a core unit reaches this interstitial state, what does it do without this like person who's coordinating it? And so we had to spend a lot of time, as you guys saw earlier, thinking flowcharts through in situations, but we added more details around nominating interim facilitators. We added a explicit call out to uncooperative offboarding facilitators. That was that flowchart we did earlier. Navigating the complexity with someone who is coming on to take over a team that's transitioning is now at least called out and defined. We also added 2 things that I feel were kind of missing and seemed like they were pretty essential. The first one was a clause for the interim time of service, right? We don't want someone being an interim facilitator for a long period of time, especially if they're also a facilitator on another core unit. That seems like crazy. So we put that in there. And we also added in the incentives to be an interim facilitator. One of the biggest criticisms and sort of thoughtful observations we had, is a better way of putting it, largest thoughtful observation we had was who's going to volunteer to be an interim facilitator. And we realized that if a unit is unwinding or if it is transitioning, what makes sense is to cap the time of service and to use the compensation from the former facilitator for that interim role. And so those are definitely 2 additional things that make it less like a forcing someone into something. That being said, picking and appointing a facilitator when the DAO or a team or we feel that we need one is still relatively incomplete. And so, we thought there was process, and this meme actually sort of encapsulates all of our situational like awareness, or all the times we went through these different situations of like, what happens if someone really likes working in bus lanes on their laptop or something like that, where there was this process for an interim fallback vote. And it's like, oh, it's exactly like water in this meme we have here. And this governance dog notices that there isn't actually any water at all. And so this is a silly joke that I put in here, but really it's realistically because the interim fallback vote really needs a little bit of help, which is why we're all here. And it's actually what I'm going to ask for. So I would love for us to use the chat bar to come up with some solutions, or if people can sort of think of some of these more long-term, we can rally these into the MIPS final revisions. And I kind of want to put these questions and next steps from there to the community that's on this call and to our extended community who's maybe watching this later, and to anybody who decides to go back to the forum. The interim fallback vote process, in case you guys aren't really aware, was simply put a list of active facilitators together and vote on a replacement, which essentially was a little bit like drawing straws with extra steps. There was no sort of where does it occur, how long does it last, what is like who's the ideal list, how do you serve on like these different committees, which is where all those changes to MIP 41 for facilitators came from. And so I'm going to put these questions out and then we can sort of pick them apart. But ideally, if we're replacing a facilitator, it should be relatively quick. Some suggestions or some questions are also, how would we vote on this? The other thing about replacing facilitators is that it was meant to be like something that the core units do themselves. And so for that, the forums come to mind, even a Zoom poll. I'm sort of curious what the platform would be for voting on this. And of course, as always, as delegates, we want to think of MKR holders. Do we want to include them as a veto? There also, unfortunately, is because of that drawing straws dynamic, there's the looming threat of having Gov Alpha take over interim duties, which is not particularly ideal. So I'd love to hear some opinions on that. And when we recommended compensation for an interim facilitator as the incentive to quote unquote volunteer, although paid volunteer, I guess, sometimes those compensation numbers are private. And so one suggestion came from Patrick, which was to use GovAlpha's recommended numbers. I'm curious if anybody feels as though there are friction for those. So I'm going to give everyone a couple of minutes to stare at this and sort of use our chat feature, and then we'll see where the conversation goes.
Well, it looks like David threw out a quick question, which asked, "What is the recommended numbers for compensation?"
Yeah, it's 33% of like a GovAlpha facilitator's salary, I think, off the top of my head. I can pull up that link though.
While you're looking that up, question that popped into my head, if you can Google and talk at the same time, would be related to the first one, which is what's the quickest process to formally pick an interim facilitator. Building off that, working in a core unit and understanding that it is a business, but it's a unique type of business. Have you put any thought into if the interim facilitator that's picked isn't supported by the contributors in the core unit? And has there been any work of maybe of the alternative where the facilitator isn't necessarily the one that needs to be replaced? It's more of the team that supports it.
Yeah, great question. There's three things there that we spent a lot of time on. The first one was what happens if you nominate someone that the community doesn't want? What happens if MKR holders don't want someone in there? The third one is what if they don't want the job? So that's why we spend a lot of time thinking through whether they want to participate and cooperate as an interim facilitator. So unfortunately, the sad part of that is that there isn't really a great solution. Inherently, like, this is the MIPified version of realizing that losing someone on your team is like puts extra work on other people, right? So yeah, that's kind of where we need the hive mind to come in and come up with some suggestions. So yeah, unfortunately, like it just kept I wouldn't say it ends at a dead end. It ends at this place where there is a process that basically no one wants to do, I think. Maybe those words might be a little strong, but I'm confident that Dow will be able to figure it out and make it happen. David asks if why wouldn't it be someone from inside the team? That would be nominating. You could nominate someone.
And anyone can nominate someone for the role?
As written, the facilitator replacement process is more of a core unit function. So, you pick someone from your team, or you pick someone who you not professionally, let's like associated, like someone who the DAO knows ideally, so that when it does become this transparent, we're voting on this replacement person to take over these duties that are now vacated by this retiring facilitator. It just doesn't come out of left field. But that was actually one of those things which I'm happy to actually do a workshop on this and like sit down and think through some of those formal simulations or situations or whatever you want to call it, where we can truly think through like what happens if there is someone in the community who is a better facilitator who isn't on the team already and they just want to get put on that volunteer list, right? That's sort of one of the things that feels still unsatisfied, right? just throw all the facilitators in and have them vote on some poll seems a little bit like it'll be messy. But there's no need to make perfect the enemy of the good. I was really more curious if we could unpack this a little bit more and maybe perhaps find it. But it might just tend to be that at this time, we don't really need that process perfectly defined, and that is okay. I mean, that's the point to MIPS, is that we can just amend them in the future as well. So I feel like that's the kind of thing where someone will have an insight, and that will sort of be the last piece that we can take forward. It was a little ambitious to hope that it would be in this call, but and I definitely feel that's the kind of thing where it becomes clear when that case is there. As I mentioned earlier, we've been pretty lucky in the sense that having facilitators step down has this, this cultural piece where it's kind of like the term of service or the tour of duty has like ended, right? And so there's a clear plan of handing over access to this platform or this thing. This is the person who's going to be taking over this. This person's to be there. I've met with them already, right? Relatively speaking, we've done that quite well. On the flip side, there's been other examples where it hasn't been as clean. And so that was the attempt to at least take some of the time on this call to really think this through and say, okay, we're going to do this vote on this platform with these people who will attend, and they will share the results in this way, right? It seems like putting it up to the voting portal to maker holders might be a nice check if we need it, if it's a significant core unit with a huge budget. But I think it really is one of those things where it's really case dependent. So, but of course, as always, it's a DAO, like the hive mind comes together. So if anyone wants to raise their hand or bring up any thoughts, or they want to put it on the forum thread, it's like we are more than open to feedback. I've been keeping this thing open for months to try and really make sure that we've got all these processes taken care
of. I think something that might be good is if we jump back to the flowchart that we quickly looked at and maybe walk through that in more detail to generate some questions.
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this references this fallback process over here in this gray square. Part of the reason we felt like detailing the fallback process a little more is because if we run into a situation where your core unit is being offboarded by someone else because it's a permissionless thing, anyone can put up a MIP, right? You may not want to participate, which is why we need to have someone come in and execute this unwinding of your core unit. And that's basically what this flowchart actually covers. The gray box inside of which is where we started our conversation a few minutes ago, is still, like I said, a little bit undefined. So, because I mean, realistically, if anyone else has ever been fired before, you're not exactly in the best mood to try and help the DAO succeed when you just got ripped out from what you were doing. So we sort of anticipated that we would want to move quickly with getting someone in there who could actually execute an unwinding in a relatively smooth way, mostly so that other core units who may be affected by the offboarding of something else, let's say, God forbid, it's someone doesn't like risk for some reason. That would be a huge pain. We would need someone in there so that they're handing off all these simulations, all these domains, everything is clearly understood. We know who it's passing to, you know what I'm saying? And that's why we spend so much time thinking about these unwinding plans and how they're budgeted, and then what does the work look like as well? Because some of us have definitely been through the decentralization grindstone before, and it's pretty hard to determine whether you're handing something off or whether you're archiving it. That's the kind of thing that just needs a guiding hand to help make decisions like that.
Yeah, and when you say quick, what kind of time frame are we talking about? Obviously as soon as possible, but do you have any definition around that?
Yeah, so this was one of the things that was already in the MIP. I think it was actually, I don't think it was explicitly defined. I think it was 40. We revised it to be 48 hours. So an interim facilitator should have their vote within 48 hours because we assumed that it would be off chain. We assumed it would be mostly core units and facilitators coming together to pick a new one. And we assume, budgets being what they are, that there will be compensation for that facilitator, right? So we're trying to stack the incentives so that we don't end up on the left part of this flow chart. We end up more on the right side where people really want to volunteer. There's 3 or 4 people who are I can handle this. It's going to take me 4 months because I can only do it 2 days a week or whatever. And they can step in to help really smoothly transition something over. But again, incentives are hard to design.
Yeah. Joshua asked the question to clarify, what were the cases we were trying to avoid again?
Cases for facilitators or cases for offboarding? Sorry, just to clarify. Oh, he wants to see the list of questions, I think. So yeah, the things we want to avoid when replacing the facilitator is we don't want someone to feel like they got the short end of the stick. We want them to feel like the incentives are aligned to actually volunteer for it. On that short end of the stick thing, if it does end up being that no one volunteers or no one wins the vote, then it just becomes Gov Alpha, which is not ideal because they're already stretched quite thin. And then one question I wanted to ask is, how do we include MKR voter holders in this process? Yeah. Which I think is actually quite important. But like I said, from the questions that are coming in right now, from the comments you've seen, the amount of time this myth has been open, this is one of those things where perfect is the enemy of the good. We're going to have to sort of figure it out on the fly. We've been through a couple messy ones and we've survived. And so ultimately, like, the whole MIP amendment does have the clarity it needs, but I push that call further to see if, to the community, to see if anybody has some ideas about the ideal platform to execute this in the perfect timeframes, and something a little bit better than, does anyone want to volunteer, quote unquote? That would be really great. You can DM forums or Discord. We're there. We're open for it.
Yeah, just to throw out one quick idea, the MKR holders could potentially be the fact check or approval of the vote, right? And that could be done through the compensation. One way to like increase the compensation could be like providing 50% up front and 50% once the offboarding is delivered. That's then executed in the executive. And if the MKR holders don't want to support it, then they don't approve it, signaling back it's vetoed, and do it again, more or less.
Yeah. To build on that, actually, that's a really good point. We have these flowcharts. We have other example sentences sort of littered throughout this amendment. It might be really good to actually just articulate one example, just like that. I think that would be super helpful. So thank you. That's a wonderful suggestion.
Yeah, definitely.
Peyton asks, what aspects of the revisions are you most worried about seeking more critical eyes? Is there anything supporting parties can do to help push this proposal forward? I don't know, Peyton, do you have 36 hours in a day? JK. I think realistically, the one situation we really kept hitting a brick wall was the one we're discussing right now, which is, what do you do when no one really wants to volunteer with the thing, when there isn't really anyone who wants to step up, but we still need that core unit. So like I said earlier, I just urge the community to think it through. I'm pretty sure we'll get it handled. So section reviewing eyes are always welcome.
Yeah, it looked like Josh had his hand up to come up on stage. If you're still interested, you are invited. So feel free to take advantage of that. Chatting through and focusing on the platform then, what were your thoughts on like a Zoom poll or the forums? Like, do you want it to be transparent to show who's supporting it, or keep it a little bit more obscured?
Yeah, this is why I gave shout outs to Blimpa and Gala, because I had a bunch of crazy ideas about involving the community, and they're like, why would you do that? I think in the auspices of transparency, it's great to, like I said earlier, tell people that this vote is coming up. Here's where it's going. Here's where it'll be conducted, and then open that call. Personally, like, it doesn't have to be perfect. I think a Zoom poll with 20 facilitators all voting in quorum on someone who came from the list, it seems to be like pretty reasonable, because then there's broad consensus and it's recorded and anyone can see it. I would prefer that call is open. It's about the only suggestion that we have there. But that was also where we went down the rabbit hole of, could you nominate anyone in the community to be a facilitator? And it seems like for interim stuff, it's quite complicated. You need a sophisticated actor who's been around for a bit. So I think the forums might be a little bit overkill.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you bring in that speed factor too. I would think forms may be a little bit slower than just organizing, say, an hour or two call, depending on how long it may take, have the
Yeah, exactly.
debate, and then have the vote.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, ultimately, like it still ends up falling on Gov Alpha to assemble the list of facilitators who would be like recognized for the role and assemble volunteers from whichever one that has to go. But that's the kind of organization you can pull together on a pretty short notice, especially if it's something tragic, like someone goes missing or they get hurt or they get sick, which is really what we're actually thinking will be the majority case, um, in addition to nominating someone else. Like I said, I really want to see the culture of MakerDAO be this more like a service thing. You come in, you serve your term, and then you either evolve into something different or you pass things off and ride into the sunset like a rodent or whatever.
yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the that concept of being sick, or let's just say win the lottery and take a year off. Would that this process would support that then, and would an offboarding pursue a different path than say like a planned interim facilitator? Would this be applicable for that situation?
Um, it would be ideally an offboarding if we're talking about one that was unplanned, right?
Yeah, most
Someone
of the
external
time.
to your team offboards you. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple checks in there. So obviously, when you're offboarding someone, when you're talking about the work that is implicit or explicit, it will become obvious who is going to take that work over. So if it is someone external to a core unit recommending that they're offboarded, then realistically you'd want to know who's going to take it over, unless you want the whole core unit gone, which is a little scorched earth and kind of unnecessary if we've already voted it in. So this process definitely works for that as well. It really comes down to, does the facilitator want to cooperate, right? We've set it up. Again, it's another aligned incentive where if you want to offboard a unit, you can't just lazily throw out vague statements and then just wait for the governance cycle and then just throw it in. You have to actually go and figure out what they're doing, which, shout out to SES. I think your guys' dashboard is going to bring a lot of transparency, so people will be able to see that yes, work is happening. We are paying for work to be done. Like it is going and showing up in fruition. And no, it doesn't happen in a week. And that should hopefully make any offboardings that do come up really based around that actual work, right?
Definitely.
So yeah, we shall see. But I mean, I'd love to see an offboarding come in that's actually like relatively clean. They say like, this team isn't performing. Like, we've talked with them, we've gone through this thing, this is how this is going, and they're like, yes, we're going to nominate this person to be a facilitator, or they're like, no, we're going to shut down the team. By adding all these little pieces of clarity across these three MIPs, we're hoping that kind of captures 85, 90% of the situations we'll find ourselves in, based on what we've seen happen anyway.
Yeah, and so much of that is so hard to plan for, like developing the core unit MIP set and then seeing how it's evolved over the past year of use. Using that as kind of a segue to wrap up the segment, since the questions seem to have dried up. You mentioned also that the DAO will need to be more selective due to the people friction of onboarding and offboarding until a more robust process is in place. If you would want to comment around maybe some of the next evolution that you may be seeing, or just some thoughts about that future state, just to kind of summarize it.
Yeah, I think that was a specific call out. I tend to sort of throw darts out there every once in a while on my delegate platform, so that's definitely where that language came from. We shouldn't kid ourselves that onboarding a core unit is difficult. Both creating one and going through any program you might grow to do it, or just YOLOing it in on the forums. And on the other hand, offboarding one is also difficult. And so the reason I wanted to do a specific call out is for folks who might not be as ingrained in this ecosystem as we all are, who are, the 12 or 15 people who are on this call right now. So, I figured it would be good for us to really just be thoughtful. We already are, by and large. I mean, you see how delegates are voting. You see the comments on the vote portal from shadow delegates. Like, people are thinking these things through. But, once like casual maker holders start to come and become more involved and they're catching up, we figured it would be prudent to at least say, should be thoughtful in the core units we onboard. We should be thoughtful in the ones that we offboard. So that's basically what I was trying to encapsulate in that sentence that I just threw in there. So I appreciate that call out.
Definitely. And I wanted to say I appreciate this call today. The effort that's gone into this and the improvements are very evident, but to talk through those changes and to appreciate the amount of thought that has went into it is definitely something that I hope continues in improving existing MIPs and drafting some more of the more impactful MIPs of the future here at Maker. But with that, we'll wrap up this Know Your MIP. Like Tim mentioned, the conversation is still ongoing on the forums, and there's opportunities to contribute. So pick up the conversation at forum.makerdao.com, and we'll see everybody on the next session.